Seems I have a tall order to follow, but thank you. What I was trying to do in my preparation for today's symposium, I really didn't want to focus a lot on the work that I'm doing here, but I really wanted to position the why this work is important at the university. Thank you for introducing me, Shelley. My pronouns are she and her, and I want to also position my Blackfoot name, which is Aki Esimoto, which means arrived a long time ago, which I was honored to be blessed by this name by Elder Francis First Charger. Today, I think I have the opportunity to share with you what I would like to call my humble world interpretation of what it refers to the myths and misconceptions of equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging at the university. For you to understand the lens through which I navigate this work, I think it's really important that I position myself as a guest on this traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which I do not take for granted that I have the honor to work, live, and learn on this land. I navigate an intersectional identity as a woman of color, a critical race scholar, feminist, a daughter of descendants of African slaves, and also as a former international graduate student. I will say many things to you today, but what I hope that you take away is that equity, diversity, and inclusion and belonging is not only a race issue, but it's also a human issue. And I also want to challenge you today that you see difference as opportunity for curiosity. My intention today is threefold. First of all, I want to increase our understanding of the purpose of equity, diversity, and inclusion on our campus. I really want to critically examine and disrupt the misconceptions of equity, diversity, inclusion work and anti-racism work, but also to create a brave space for a critical conversation. I know this may seem like an uncomfortable topic, and I really hope that you bear with me as we move along on this journey, because it will be uncomfortable, because it is a very complex topic that we're going to discuss today. To build some awareness, I would like to position some key definitions, talk about setting the context of what the changing landscape of post-secondary institution is looking like in regards to EDI work. I want to unpack critically the business and ethical case for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I really want to spend some time to talk about some, which I call 5 misconceptions, but there are several, of what we call EDI work. Spend a little time to talk about the dangers of performative allyship, and share with you a very short video that I think truly encapsulates the work that we're intending to do on our campus. I hope to close off with what I call a call to action, which I hope, now that we know, we cannot no longer unsee what we have known. So the definitions that I want to start with today is, what is equity, diversity, and inclusion and belonging? We've all heard those concepts thrown around very casually, but sometimes we're not really sure what it means. So I'm going to use an analogy of someone getting invited to a party, and I'm going to define those concepts as follow. When we think of diversity, diversity refers to all of the various ways that we are uniquely different, all the unique diversity dimensions we navigate as individuals, be it based on race, gender expression, diversity of thought, marital status, socioeconomic status. When we think of the concepts of equity, it really speaks to a fair and equitable treatment, access and opportunity for advancement. So it would ask simply who's been invited into the room or who's been invited to the party. When we think of concepts of inclusion, it's really about who has been included or feels seen and heard and feels that their voices matter at the decision-making table. Now, the challenge with equity, diversity, and inclusion is that we cannot have one concept over the other. So we can't have more diversity, more inclusion, and not have them come from an intersectional lens. And when we say that, when those concepts intersect, we are focused on creating an authentic sense of belonging. It means that we are safe, we are seen, we are heard, and we are respected in the places and spaces that we are in. Another term that I want to define today is what we call racism. And I use the premise that racism is a social construct. And I want to use a definition that has been positioned by Al-Shahib, who wrote an article very recently about building a race-conscious institution. And she defines it as systems and structures that exercise power over one group of people based on skin color, implicit or explicit sets of beliefs or biases, erroneous assumptions, and actions based on ideology of racial superiority. So when we look at the concept from a racially being seen as a socially constructed phenomenon, it looks at three critical components. The first is where we look at the personal mediation of racial discrimination. We look at the challenges of institutional racism, and as well as the challenges of structural racism. And you would ask me, so what do you mean by that? So when we look at it's personal beliefs or biases that may have unintentionally or intentionally allowed us to exclude or push to the periphery specific voices or stories. When we look at concepts of institutional racism, we're looking at how has an institution perpetuated or allowed the permanencies of excluding specific voices. And when we look at the concepts of structural racism, we're looking at how systems, policies, and processes have been built to exclude specific stories and voices. So there is a really easy analogy that I like to use. We all need to wear shoes and we all need to buy shoes. So when we look at equity, or we look at the term equality, is we're looking at everyone getting a pair of shoes. And when we look at the concepts of diversity, it's simply asking, does everyone have a different type of shoe? When we look at equity, it's about ensuring that we all get a pair of shoes that fits us. When we look at concepts of acceptance, it's about understanding that we all wear different kinds of shoes. But the most important part of this process is ensuring that when we speak about belonging, that everyone can wear the shoe that they like and that fits them without feeling judged or marginalized. So 2020 was a year that was plagued with significant events. We navigated a pandemic. We all watched on television the death of George Floyd, the resurgence of the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Movement, but also the discovery of several unmarked graves within Canada. Post-secondary institutions, corporates Canada, provincial and federal governments were called to action about what are we going to do about this issue that we have. Agencies, institutions, and structures and individuals were no longer allowed to unsee the dehumanization of Indigenous, Black, and Brown bodies and had to do something about it. So although these incidents, I would argue, was of great importance, it is not something that it was unknown or unheard of for Black, Indigenous, and Brown bodies. The truth is, they've always known, or we have always known. We've always had to focus of how do we continue to call out or call in and challenge the complexities of social injustices. Recently also, many institutions and post-secondary institutions, for example, were charged with how are you going to live out the Universities of Canada's inclusion excellence principles and policies. We also looked at the Scarborough Charter that focused on anti-Blackness and Black inclusion. But most importantly, we also looked at the 94 calls to action for truth and reconciliation. And this is also very pertinent because we are going to be celebrating Truth and Reconciliation Week in the coming week. So the challenge and the danger that I would argue is that Canada has been positioned as a country of multiculturalism, as a mosaic of cultures, but it also suffers from what I would usually call, or what the research shows, an angel complex. And the angel complex simply means that it's always looked at, this is not an issue here, we treat everybody fairly, this is a US issue. Critical race makes us feel bad about ourselves. There are polarizing views about EDI and anti-racist work. And there's also the issue of this new wokeness that we all have to be navigating. But the challenge is that we do have an issue that we all have to do our work to address. Statistics Canada has stated that despite the emphasis on multiculturalism and social equality in education policies, people living in Canada are not always treated fairly or equally. Indigenous people and those designated as visible minorities, quote, and I don't like the term visible minorities, I think it should be historically excluded or racialized voices, generally report feeling less safe than the rest of the population, in some cases, and much more likely to be overrepresented in our justice systems. The average pay for a visible minority or racialized minority is usually 30% lower in a similar sized workplace. Or, as we have seen through the results of the COVID-19 pandemic, that underrepresented groups are at greater risk of physical and mental health outcomes due to structural and institutional racism. So your question might be, to me, would be like, what does this have to do with anything, or why does this matter? I think it's important that for us to examine where we are today, it's really an important note for us to know where we've come from. We have been coming from a settler colonial, and I noticed Miranda talked a lot about it in her presentation. We come from a settled colonial society that has a history of slavery, of indentured servitude, segregation, exclusionary immigration policies, and with the right, what we see right now is the growing polarization with white nationalist ideologies. Many would argue that this is not something that is pervasive or existing within our context, and I would argue, like even right here in our province in Alberta, that we do have a history of marginalization and exclusion of specific voices and stories. Sarah Mohammed talks about this really interesting quote that says, "The body that causes discomfort is always the one that has to work hard to make others uncomfortable." Disruption or discomfort happens when bodies stick out, when they are disrupting white spaces. So the issue is that we do have an issue and we have to do something about it. So you cannot speak about EDI work or equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging work, I know it's a mouthful, without talking about power. Foucault would argue that power produces, legitimizes truth, and created processes of representation, but more so, it privileges certain voices over others. Who do we define as competent? Who do we find as able-bodied? Who do we define as good scholar or good student? Who do we define as accomplished researcher? Power is always at the center of EDI issues, and we cannot negate that fact. So the question here today is, but what if? And there's this really, really good analogy that I like to use that shows a group of people looking out onto a field, watching a game. Some are able to see, some are not able to see. Some need boxes and some don't need boxes. But what if? What if we were, as an institution, able to remove those boxes, and use this metaphorically, and these fences, so that we can all get to see the game from a space where we don't feel that we have to get our voices heard. So I think as an agent of change, as an institution, our journey to reconciliation must start with the acknowledgement of truth and the realization that the playing field has not always been leveled. So what does this matter? So whenever you're bringing a new concept or you're trying to incite change into an institution, there's always the question is like, well, what's the purpose or what's the business case behind it? And I would argue, I think it's a business case and an ethical case. I think it's about creating better educational outcomes, experiences, and opportunities for all our staff, faculty, students, and our community. It's about creating safe, accessible, and inclusive spaces for all. It's about a re-examination of our policies and processes that historically exclude certain voices and stories in the academic spaces. I think universities have an ethical responsibility to lead the way in addressing the systemic barriers that exist and continue to exist within education. But most importantly, I think it's really about building an inclusive excellence on our campuses. So what is the common myth? And I'm intentionally looking at 5. There's like a lot of them. But I thought the 5 that would be the most impactful for me to unpack, disrupt, and also challenge a little bit. And the first that I want us to think through today is the called meritocracy. Some of us have heard the phrase where I have worked really hard to get to where I am. Why don't these people get over it, or why can't we just move on? The reality is that there are structural systems and policies that do exclude specific stories and voices. For example, there was this phenomenon that was written by Dr. Keisha Thomas where she said, sometimes you go from a pet to a threat. And I was like, well, what does that mean? So sometimes you have to work 3 times as hard to be seen or to be equally considered competent. So when we say that, we all work very hard. I'm not going to be naive or negate that fact. But the reality is that some have to work twice as hard to be seen equal or to even be recognized. EDI work is about a lowering of standards. This is a misconception where EDI usually is seen as creating a way of increasing access for underrepresented or historically excluded groups, and the only way to do that is that we are lowering the standard. This perception that diversity hires, or diversity in itself, is about seeing difference as deficient, I think is problematic. I would argue that a lowering of standards still is an indication of the continuous permanence of racial and social injustices that actually exist within spaces. The third one that I want to talk about is this causes more harm than good. So McLean and Company and Korn Ferry Group have shown that when diversity is included within teams, it increases performance and engagement by 30%. So this is not an attack on able-bodied, straight, white male, but it's about, are we open to looking at diversity as an opportunity for creativity and for innovation? So I would challenge us, instead of focusing on the fears that it potentially may come with, and I acknowledge that it will come with that we get curious and see it as an opportunity for further conversation. Myth number 4 is that it takes away from one group to give to another. I always get really curious about this statement because what if we were in a room and there were tables and chairs and all we had to do was simply remove the table and open up a space for conversation and create different entry points to the decision-making process? What if we were building more representation and bringing diverse voices and expertise into the space? How about if we were to see this as a reshifting or releveling of a playing field that was never equitable in the first place? Myth number 5, I treat everyone the same. This is quite problematic when you treat Indigenous Black voices, Black and brown bodies the same. You negate the uniqueness and the diversity dimensions they navigate, and you other them. If we were to go back to the analogy of the shoes that I showed you earlier on, I think it's about ensuring that we have what we need to be seen, to be valued, to be respected, and to thrive. So I know I've talked really quickly here, because I'm just trying to be cognizant of time, about what those misconceptions are. And you may agree with me, and that's okay. But I'm just putting it out there as an opportunity for self-reflection and for some critical debate. One of the challenges with equity work is performative allyship. We have to be cautious, or careful, I would say, about not getting stuck in the feel-good performative of policy. And Sarah Ahmed talks a lot about it. to not getting stuck on how EDI issues are weaponized or how we are supporting them to ensure that there is no failures of these programs. I think equity, diversity, and inclusion work has to be intentional, impactful, and sustainable change. It's about consistency and congruency, but more importantly, it's about accountability, a speaking up, and a calling in. The next piece I want to talk about is the continuum that we move through when we are becoming an ally or an advocate. And the word allyship is really about advocacy, and it's about action. You will feel uncomfortable. You will make mistakes. I have made several. But I want us to not stop trying. We have to continue, and we have to move forward. So I know that this may seem uncomfortable, but this work is complex. There is no one-pill solution. We are trying to shift a culture that has taken decades to be built. So my challenge to you today is to confront the discomfort that you feel. This is complex work. It will be triggering, but I encourage you and I challenge you to lean into that discomfort. I want you to challenge your assumptions about your single story, as Chimamanda would say, and acknowledge that your biases sometimes limit your worldview. And I'm going to say we all have our biases. I do too. I'm hoping this video works. I want to show this really short video that was put out recently by a Conferry who's been doing a lot of research into what EDI work can look like and how it can actually open up the space for conversation. So hopefully it works and you can hear it okay.
Can you feel it? This shift, like the earth moved a bit. Like what wasn't possible before is now almost in our grip. Can you hear it? The chant, like this moment is ours. Like the whole world is watching, like this is the start. Can you see it? Our ambition as we move towards a new vision by reimagining what we know and giving hope a new description. This is the moment. Nothing matters more than this. We have the chance to create real change instead of just empty words and promises. Together, we can do this. Lift every hand, lift every voice, for every person, for every purpose, for every unheard voice. Diversity is more than just a poster. Inclusion shouldn't be a burden. A plethora of identities create ideas way bigger than one person. And that is the future we are after. A future we are trying to create, where people who look like me or you can build, design, and innovate.
There is power
in our difference.
We are ready
and we are strong.
The future is ours to shape. But which side of history will you be on?
So my intention was not in any way to create any polarization of ideas, but it's to just offer you, like I said, an option for critical reflection. So I would leave with this wording from Lattice and Buildings, which states that it's important that we keep our feet to the fire. And I use fire because it's uncomfortable. And we keep moving forward. This work is hard work, and it needs to focus on creating a better future for the generations to come. So this happens when we build an anti-racist organization. We collectively, as leaders, students, staff, and faculty, do this work. We create safe psychological spaces for all. We remove systemic barriers that exclude voices, stories, and experiences. We develop inclusive policies and processes. We look at inclusive hiring practices in recruitment, hiring, promotion, and development. We become mentors and sponsors, inclusion champions, and advocates. So now that you know, we can no longer unsee it. And if you may indulge me, I want to close with this quote from one of my favorite authors, Toni Morrison, which says, "If you are free, you need to free somebody else. And if you have power, then your job is to empower someone else." So with that, I want to challenge all of us today that EDI work on campus is not a one-person thing, but it's a collective responsibility. And I call out to all of you that I would really love working with all of you to see how we can make this a place that we are even more proud of. And with that, I say thank you. Does anybody have any questions for me? I know it was hard stuff, sorry. You can ask me questions. I promise I don't bite. Yes. That's a great question. So I think what I would say to that is two things. I think the first thing, when they say that they want you to treat them like everybody else, they don't want to be consistently conscious of being the other person in the room. That's the first thing. The second thing is, you don't want to say that, well, I don't see color, because we do see color, and we have to acknowledge that we do see color. And I think by negating that people are different is by not actually seeing them as a person. So I think it's a fine mix of, like I said, remember I showed the analogy of the shoe, right? It's like giving them what they need so that they don't feel judged. Don't make them super conscious that they're a person of color or they're indigenous. Treat them like a human being, I would say, is my best rule of thumb. But always acknowledging that their stories or their lens is going to be very different than your own, right? I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, that does? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. I have never silenced a room. That is weird. Yes.
Actually, what you were saying, and the question reminded me of a novel I read about the pardon expression in interracial marriage between a man from China and a man from the States. They had a child, and the mother-in-law, her mother came to join them. And what she said to her grandson was, "I know you're Chinese, but what I see is my grandson." And I think that sort of personalizes what the little question was asking.
Mm-hmm.
So that I mean, I know you're black, but I see you as a university,
Mm-hmm.
an intelligent woman, and that's what I think I try to see when I look at people.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you shouldn't see that. That's not okay to say that you shouldn't see me as a person. I'm not saying that. But it's important that we acknowledge that our identities are part of who we are. Like, we can't separate and say that I'm just this person. You know what I mean? No, and I wasn't saying that. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm communicating clear enough that that you're understanding and everyone understands what I'm saying. The negation of someone's identity is a negation of their stories. So we have to be very cautious that we don't do that. But I still think it's about not othering them to say, oh, you are the other person, or you are not from here, or which we consistently get asked, like, where are you from? Those questions are quite triggering for someone based on whether the stories or the circumstances they've come from. And I do know that this work is very polarizing and very uncomfortable. But the important thing is that we have to make sure we see the human in the person that's standing in front of us, right? And all the packages that they come with, if I were to use an analogy. But great point. Yes. So I think for me, I would not want someone to negate for me that I'm an immigrant settler in Canada or I'm a woman of color. That's part of the intersecting identity that I navigate. I think it's important when the labels become problematic is when it's used to marginalize or oppress specific voices. That's kind of when I think it becomes problematic. Does that answer your question? Excellent. Okay. Shelley, I saw your hand up and I saw it went down.
Yeah, that's right. I was just thinking about it from a teaching
Okay.
perspective. I was thinking that so often when in the classroom, I teach in the drama department, and for example, there's a play that is by non-white authors, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And frequently I find that the students are uncomfortable talking about that play because they really don't have the right to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, there's nobody in this classroom who is of that spiritual background,
Mm-hmm.
cultural background, and so it would be so much more wonderful if there was,
Mm-hmm.
put that person on the spot, have this right to, just to have that majority of voice, then maybe the difference, feel that they can't talk about something because they're afraid to break the wall.
And that's a very good point, Shelley. And I think I will encourage you to talk about it because the only way you're going to get through the discomfort of it is that you have to engage in this, what I call, I know there is a lot of stuff about safe spaces for conversation. It needs to be brave because it takes courage to do this work because people will get annoyed, people will get uncomfortable, but you have to start somewhere. And if we keep saying, well, I don't want to do it because it's uncomfortable, then we're never going to be able to bring to the center the actual issues that we're trying to address, which is representation and diversity of voices and stories and experiences within the space, right? So I would challenge them, like, take a moment to figure out where is this discomfort coming from, because it's coming from somewhere. So I would encourage them to actually engage in those conversations, even though they are very uncomfortable. And I can tell you it is uncomfortable. Yes, Shelley. Sure. Mm-hmm. 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 You blend it in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But there's also a lot of research that's coming out to say that has a lot to do with psychological safety. So I don't want to be the one that gets singled out, picked on, or so I'm just want to blend in, go with the flow underneath the radar so no one bothers me. I think that's why when we talk about EDI work, is really about a shifting of a culture that has been established for a long time. So it's really about being aware of it, first of all. I think we have to acknowledge it exists and what we need to do about it. But it's not in any way about a singling out or calling out, it's a calling in. And I use the calling in intentionally because I think when people have differences of opinion, we should get curious to understand the why, because there's always a why. It's not about saying everybody needs to have this EDI speak or think the same way. It's about, even though there are differences of thought or opinions, we should have the brave enough space to have the conversation. So, but yeah, I think it has a lot to do with psychological safety, to be quite honest. Yeah. Yes, Erica. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's why I talked about the polarizing effect of it. It is a cancel culture. It's very, very complex space. I try to lead from a place of curiosity and authenticity. So I know I've made mistakes. I've used a they or a she instead of like what I needed to use. It has happened. But I hope that we acknowledge that we're all not perfect and we're all on a journey. I know the public sphere is not as gracious as we are, but I hope that we, and maybe I'm stubbornly hopeful or naive, maybe, but I am stubbornly hopeful is what I'm going to lead with. Like I'm using John Lewis's quote, that we don't shy away from those things. Even when it happens, we don't just cower and go away. I think cancel culture is also a way of us acknowledging that there is a lot of fear around this. There's a lot of fragility. I don't want to be seen as a racist person, or I just don't want people to think I'm a bad person. And the reality is, it takes a lot of courage to call someone in to say, I heard you made this comment. It made me very uncomfortable. Help me understand what that was for you, because I'm not sure I'm understanding or may have missed something. And I think it actually is better to call them in than cancel them out, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my thoughts. It's a loaded question, Erica, but it's okay. Yes. Hi, Mikey. Hi, Mikey. Yes. 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 Yes.
In my personal opinion, I feel like there's a direct connection between whether or not a person's going to be canceled and how they respond to that calling in. I was just wondering if you might be able to.
Yeah, I think it's really about the authenticity of the apology. I think if it seems like it's a tick box, well, I'm sorry, and I'm just move on, people can tell if you're not being genuine or not. So I would always say, if you make a mistake, own it, apologize authentically, and move forward, but move forward in a way that is accountable. Like not just say, I'm sorry for this one, and not move forward and fix it going forward. You know what I mean? So I think it takes a lot of courage to say, I was wrong, or I'm sorry. And to do this work in EDI space, I can tell you, I have had to say I'm sorry or I was wrong many times. But that doesn't take away from the ability to do the work. I think if we could lead by example and call things out or call things in when we need to, and apologize for it, I think that's, humans beings just want to be heard at the end of the day. They just want to be heard. And it's nothing wrong in to say I'm sorry. I don't know. Yes. Yes.
So what are your thoughts about taking this work on seriously, this uncomfortable work in the classroom, for props, who have student evaluation, performance evaluation, those kinds of things to think about?
That's a great question. I think in the post-secondary context, if you looked at what has happened, a lot of organizations are actually trying to figure out what can we do better to make this a safer space for students and for faculty and staff as well. I do think there's a lot of educational pieces that have to be included in here as well, because I think our students are very diverse right now, and their interpretation of what is good scholarship or learning is very interesting. So I'm going to use Bell Hooks as a really great author who wrote a lot about teaching to transgress and about the importance of creating space for critical debate in the classroom. I think we have to, like the whole purpose of the Lib Ed is about how do we create breadth and critical thinking. I challenge us, like we should be actually using that so often in everything that we do in the classroom, in our research, because we have an opportunity to shape the future generations. So what are we going to do about it? Are we going to just do the same traditional thing? Or are we going to be comfortable disrupting ourselves in about how we do the scholarship or how we build policy or how we do research? So I do think it's not a one-person thing. I think everybody has a little piece of the pie or the puzzle that they have to put together to make it really work. So to your question is, there's a lot of work that post-secondaries have to do. And it's not just administrators, it's faculty, it's students, it's the community, it's like everybody. Because what we are wanting to do is build a culture that is of inclusive excellence. And it's not one thing that one person can do. I don't know if that answers your question, but I know it's like there's a lot that we have to do, if I would answer it honestly. Sure, go ahead and follow up.
If you're successful, it should show up in student evaluations that are then read by administrators as who are trying to get promoted and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Don't you think that puts some limits and barriers on the professor in the classroom because they're thinking about
Okay.
like 10 years ago?
So here's me about the evaluations. And this is my opinion, so please take it within quotes. I think the professors, and I'm not a faculty member or a scholar or anything, but I'm just going to talk as a practitioner here. I think if we do responsible, and I would say accountable scholarship, where we are creating a space for conversation that is not hurting or harming our students, I think we should walk away feeling I've done my piece today in improving or building responsible citizenship in our students. So if we are hurting and harming our students, that's problematic, I think. But that's how I'm going to end your question. It's a very broad one, and I don't think there's any right or wrong answer, to be honest. No questions. Thank you very much.